there are a lot of men who listen to our podcast, who come to our workshop, who have really tried to work a program of recovery. And in those, they've struggled because the focus has just been on behavior. It just focuses on the fantasy, or it focuses on the ritual. Don't do these behaviors anymore. Just stop the acting out. And then it leads you to despair. If you're just trying to stop the behavior at the bottom part of the cycle, I don't think you're ever going to experience freedom. What really changes is when we move to the top of the cycle, and where there's woundedness, we experience healing. Where there's shame, we experience truth. And where there's fantasy, we move into reality. And so the wounds become healing, the shame becomes truth, and we move from fantasy into reality. And so when we begin to experience that, then we don't even get to the bottom part of the cycle, and that's when we begin to experience freedom.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're back again today with our host, Dr. Greg Miller. I'm Randy Evert, your co-host, and once again, we are very happy to have the Director of Faithful and True, Debbie Laaser, with us. Deb, how are you doing today?
Just great, thank you.
Thanks for joining us again today. Well, on our last podcast, we started a conversation about navigating the various seasons of recovery and to find your voice in recovery. Today, we're going to talk about understanding addiction interaction in light of the addiction cycle.
Okay, great. And so to begin with, it might be helpful to do a little bit of a history lesson. So Patrick Carnes, back in the late 70s, early 80s, wrote Out of the Shadows and Don't Call It Love. And he was the first, as I understand it, that really identified an addiction cycle for someone struggling with sex addiction.
That's right.
And at the beginning of the cycle actually is some sort of trauma or abuse. That would be the language that he would use. Then that would create shame in the person. And then that shame would lead to a desire to escape through fantasy or preoccupation, which then would lead us to the rituals. And we've talked before on our podcast that a ritual is anything that you do that makes it possible for you to act out sexually. And then you have your behavior of acting out. And then for the person acting out, it leads to despair. And we're going to have this cycle available to you for those of you that are watching on YouTube, so that you can see exactly what it is that we're talking about. But kind of in summary, to be able to say, if you've ever felt like you are on a hamster wheel in your addiction, you discovered what Pat Carnes discovered in the late 70s, that there is this cycle that we go through once we get on the cycle of addiction.
And I think it's just important for us to be grateful for the work that led him to this really profound information. And I think that was one of the gifts of Dr. Carnes, is that he had the ability to look at a lot of information and kind of simplify it down to something that was understandable. So I think it made sense for people to understand themselves and how they got into this, like you said, a hamster wheel where they just couldn't stop, at least stop for good.
Right.
You know, a lot of people figured out how to stop for a while, but to stay stopped was the ultimate goal.
Right. And one of the things that we teach at the workshop, because we do talk about the cycle of addiction, is that cycle for some people could be a 2-year process, or it could be a 24-hour process. But the bottom line is, if I look at my history, I can see this continuing repetitive behavior and experience that starts with some sort of experience of pain that led to shame. And what I'm wanting to escape from is that shame that leads to the fantasy or the preoccupation. And one of the things that we teach is this idea that all fantasies are rescue fantasies. If I'm fantasizing, I want to be rescued from something and I want to be rescued to something. But that fantasy then leads to the behaviors, the rituals that make it possible for me to then act out. And I do think it's helpful for us to recognize that the cycle doesn't begin with the behavior. The cycle actually begins in those early experiences where we do experience trauma, where we are wounded. In fact, for the men that have been to our workshop, one of the things that we teach is that Mark Laaser modified Patrick Carnes' cycle of addiction and began talking about wounds, both from our family and also from culture. I think that was one of the great offerings that Mark had is he helped us to understand if our only focus is what happened in our families, we're actually missing out on a significant part of our story that could also result in abandonment or invasion that would then lead to the shame that we experience.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think another major change was accepting that abuse, which is something generally we see results of abuse, that abandonment issues can be just as significant, if not more so.
Right.
And so I know in our counseling center, we do place a lot of emphasis on understanding both of those things from earlier life stories.
Right.
We have a number of people along the way who really question why we need to look back. And, there are a lot of folks that say, hey, listen, we know this was a problem. We're not going to do it anymore. Let's just forget and move on. Our belief, though, is if we really want to understand root causes of why we do what we do need to understand that woundedness, both abuse and abandonment, and more things that are coming out of your research as well,
Right.
that are contributing to shame and that huge emotion that we all want to get rid of, because it's a horrible feeling to feel like we're not worthy and valuable, that there's something wrong with us. And we do whatever we can to cover that up or get rid of it and get away from it. So that's really a foundational building block to everything that starts to happen.
Right. And for those of you that regularly listen to our podcast, you've heard us talk about abandonment and invasion before. But if you're new to us, I just want to quickly identify invasion is when something happens to a child that should not have happened. Abandonment is when the child had a need and that need goes unmet. And what we teach is invasion and abandonment happen in the home, and invasion and abandonment happen outside of the home. And I teach that we all experience invasion, we all experience abandonment. So the question isn't, did I experience it? It's to what extent. So it's a continuum. And there are those who experience less invasion and abandonment, those who experienced more. But what we see is whatever level of invasion and abandonment we experience, whatever the woundedness is, it does result in shame. And shame are the negative core beliefs that I believe about who I am. It's about my identity. I am worthless. I am pathetic. I'm a loser, whatever my shame sounds like. And the reality is that shame comes from pain. And the way that I define it is shame are the lies that I believe about myself and I believe about God. It's interesting. If I believe something about me as the creation, I also believe something about the Creator. And we want to get in there and help people to understand what is the truth of who you are and the truth of who God is.
And I might even add to that it's also what we believe other people believe about us, especially authority figures or those who are supposedly older or wiser or in a role that supposedly know more than we do. When we receive their judgments about things, it's really hard to listen then to maybe what's really true about myself. So it can be really difficult to work through without, again, professional help, I believe. Figuring out what these old core, distorted as we call them, core beliefs are, how they got there, what were the life experiences that led one to believe in certain things, and then how can we work out of that to update our core beliefs as an adult today. It's really what I call it's the cycle of the counseling journey, right. is figuring those things out, because that's where we can lead into a more joyful, peaceful life for ourselves.
Absolutely. And one of the things, there are a lot of men who listen to our podcast, who come to our workshop, who have really tried to work a program of recovery. And in those, they've struggled because the focus has just been on behavior. And so if you've ever been a part of a program and it really just focuses on the bottom part of the cycle, it just focuses on the fantasy, or it focuses on the ritual, don't do these behaviors anymore, just stop the acting out, and then it leads you to despair. If you're just trying to stop the behavior at the bottom part of the cycle, I don't think you're ever going to experience freedom. What really changes is when we move to the top of the cycle, and where there's woundedness, we experience healing. Where there's shame, we experience truth. And where there's fantasy, we move into reality. And so the wounds become healing, the shame becomes truth, and we move from fantasy into reality. And so when we begin to experience that, then we don't even get to the bottom part of the cycle, and that's when we begin to experience freedom.
That's true. And so even like trying to eliminate fantasy, I know there are a lot of wives that are very concerned about that piece. They would like to know what their husbands are fantasizing about, which, by the way, I don't believe is a good idea for you to explore, because what one is fantasizing about is not really what the problem is.
Right.
As you were saying, it's really a messenger to you about something else in your life you're trying to heal. And so when they get direction on how to use fantasy or emotions, either one, or thoughts, stories in our head to help us really understand what our deeper needs are, our soul desires, then we can start making progress to find healthy ways to get those things met.
Absolutely. So one of the questions of fantasy is, what pain am I wanting to avoid by engaging this fantasy? Is it about my grief, my sadness, my loneliness, my insecurities? But again, a fantasy wants to rescue us from something and then rescue us to something. So if I'm feeling lonely, I want a fantasy to rescue me from my loneliness and rescue me to connection or community. If I'm insecure, I want the fantasy to rescue me from insecurity to confidence. And those conversations actually become pretty productive because it allows us to see that there is a messenger from our soul. There is a need behind the fantasy that it's helpful to begin to identify.
Yeah.
One thing that we talked about is it is helpful to be given some language. And you talked about the fact that part of Patrick Carnes' ability was to take a large gathering of data and information and then try to summarize it or draw conclusions or even to create an image of it. And there is something normalizing about that. To be able to, I know that when we teach this at the workshop, there's kind of a nodding of the head. There's a familiarity to this. And it is so helpful to be given some language around it. If we can understand it, then we can begin to change it. We also talked about this idea of addiction interaction. And it's this recognition that a lot of the men who come through our workshop don't just struggle with sexual addiction, but they have other addictions, or at the least they have other coping strategies. And I think one of the ways that we can understand the addiction cycle is how there are behaviors, experiences, beliefs that intersect with each other, and they can either fuel each other or work independently, but it's the same principle. If I'm a workaholic, I want to be rescued from something and be rescued to something. The thing that we teach about sex addiction, it's not about sex, it's about how you're using sex. Workaholism isn't about how much you work, it's about what you're wanting to try to get from your work. And what are your work fantasies that can lead to those work rituals, the overworking. And then you overwork, that would be the acting out piece, and then it leads to the despair, which would be the burnout. And so one of the things when Mark was teaching this, he would often talk about what he referred to as the crazy eight, and there was this switching station. And so for a lot of men who struggle with sex addiction, when they got to the despair place, one of the things that they would do is switch to their workaholism in order to work enough to save them from the sex addiction. And especially for men who are involved in the church or in professional ministry, the shame that they feel about the sexual addiction, they try to redeem by overworking and overperforming at church. And so understanding if you have several things that are either addictions or coping strategies, there can be ways that they're interacting with each other that makes each of them more powerful.
So what's true, and I know Mark did a research project on this with ministry folks that came here for help, is he found that over 50% of those that came actually had both of the workaholism and the sexual addiction going at the same time. And so, it's true that we typically have more than just one way that we're managing pain in our life. And it can be helpful, I think, also to know that when we're trying to stop something which has been used as a way of managing our pain, it's not like a light switch where all of a sudden we just stop it, all that pain has been taken care of, and we're good to go. Typically it is a process of also slowly moving into healthier behaviors, having a voice, learning those things that help you not hide away with pain and so forth. And it makes sense that you might choose something else that's less hurtful to add to your life for a time to help medicate. So I know as I work with wives, this can be a huge concern because maybe their husbands are telling them that they're working a really good program and they've been sober for 6 months, let's just say. And what the wife is noticing is that they've also gained about 40 pounds in the last 6 months. And they're saying things like, well, clearly something's wrong. And, if he's been lying to me all this time, I wonder if he's still really struggling. And, I see it in these other out of control behaviors right now. That is rather typical, to be honest. Eating is maybe something he will want to look at and take care of at some point. And for the time being, it's less hurtful to her, the relationship, and the marriage if he can use something else less hurtful for a time while he's figuring out all the pain of the past.
Absolutely. I know in my own story, and a story that I hear regularly is, for me, TV is one of my coping strategies. And if you know my family story, it makes perfect sense. The TV was always on. And we would gather around the TV at night and watch things together. We would sit at the table and watch the TV. And so early in my recovery, I could see that I was sexually sober and I was kind of coping with all of the chaos and the pain that was getting stirred up by not acting out, by watching TV. And Beth and I would have these conversations, and it was valid. She would be concerned because she was aware of the amount of TV that I was watching and the way that maybe at times the amount that I was watching was even expanding. And so it was helpful for her to understand very much what you've said. It is a coping strategy, and the goal is not to be overly dependent upon our coping strategies, and at the same time to recognize it's kind of the difference between taking cocaine and taking Tylenol.
Right.
If the sex addiction is the cocaine, totally out of control, totally destructive, if every once in a while a man is taking Tylenol to deal with some pain, that actually can be a helpful part of his recovery as he's trying to navigate some intense issues.
I think this is another reason why we love having wives participate in our programs here, because while their issues are different, there are many things that we can learn about each other and why we do what we do, because the terminology is somewhat the same. What's true, you said it a little bit ago, we all have coping behaviors or substances we use when life gets hard. It's just what we do. And in a way, it's a smart thing that we've learned how to do that, because we'd all be falling apart all over the place all the time. And, if it helps sometimes to eat some extra ice cream late at night because you're moving through a very intense time of sadness over something, well, just go for it, I say.
Right.
Write that down. I can have ice cream.
Yes, you can
Good.
write that
Okay.
down.
Deb gave the okay on ice cream.
Yeah. And it's good to know that we too have coping mechanisms. Ours are just different. And to understand why we do what we do will also lead us to watch our cycle too, and watch when we really don't like who we are when we're doing certain things and it's not serving us or our relationships well. When do we want to change something so that we can find a healthier way to manage whatever the pain or emotions are that are coming up for us?
Well, and I would even say part of the dynamic of coping is I'm attuned to what I'm doing. So I know I'm watching this extra TV show, or I'm binging on British murder mysteries, which is one of my things.
Yeah.
Or I'm having that extra bowl of ice cream, but there's a consciousness to it, and I'm aware that it's not going to rescue me. The danger of the addiction is this belief that this experience, this substance, this behavior is going to rescue me from me, and there's nothing that can rescue me from me. But to be able to say for a season, it's acceptable. It may not be the long-term strategy, but it's okay if I have some of these things in my life that help me to medicate and manage some pain that is surfacing as I deal with my recovery. One of the things I often talk to men about is one of the ways that you can know your recovery is working is that you want to act out. Because what's happening is you're not acting out. So all of the stuff that you've been avoiding is starting to surface, and it makes sense that you want relief. I use the image, if I have knee surgery and they give me Tylenol 3 with codeine for knee surgery, and I stop taking it, what ends up happening is I feel pain, and then what do I want? I want some more of my pain medication. So even that awareness of, okay, I'm not failing if I want my drug. I'm not failing if I want to escape. It's just, do I steward this moment in a redemptive way? And instead of reaching for something that is destructive, I reach for something that is healthy. Instead of choosing the isolation of addiction, I choose to reach out and connect with my community. So it's stewarding that moment, recognizing actually this is good because I'm starting to feel some stuff that historically I'd medicated.
And it's rather a nice segue too from what we just talked about in terms of having a voice, because as we start to be able to identify what the pain is, loneliness, fear, anxiety, boredom, whatever, we can also then have a voice to take it somewhere with somebody else who knows our story and share it with them. And there is something in that sharing experience that always lifts us a tiny bit out of that place to maybe make that healthier decision. And so whether it's wives or men working on an addiction for themselves, it's the same for both of us. Having that voice, learning to use that, not isolate, is going to be one of the healthiest things we can do to begin to change our choices.
Yeah. You know, another idea of this addiction interaction is when two of our coping strategies or addictions actually feed off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the stories that I hear regularly are men who have a unhealthy relationship with alcohol and struggle with sexual addiction, that they use their drinking as either a way to connect with people or as its own form of medication to help them to relax in order to engage conversation. And so the reality is, if I'm going to be serious about my sex addiction, I'm also going to have to be serious about my relationship with alcohol. Another combination, we talked about that addiction interaction of the switching and the crazy eight, but for some men, their workaholism and their sexual addiction actually go together. They overwork, they are at trade shows, or they travel for work, and that travel gave them the opportunity to be away in a different circumstance and allowed them to act out. And so it makes sense for them addressing the workaholism, and their travel or whatever might have been a contributing factor, and along with their sex addiction is going to be very important. And they will probably need to do that simultaneously.
Or I think also work contributes to that belief that I'm entitled to treat myself to something.
I deserve it.
Because I have overworked and I'm working way longer hours than anybody else around here. And therefore, I deserve to do something nice that feels good to me. And I know entitlement is something Mark used to talk about a lot, that many professional men struggled with because a lot of their jobs did require a lot of work if they weren't good at balancing their life.
Right. Well, and one of the things that we teach about entitlement is that in order for there to be entitlement, there needs to be a core belief that gives you that permission. And so, for instance, if I work hard, I'm supposed to be appreciated. And therefore, if I'm not appreciated, then that means I'm entitled to take care of myself. Life is supposed to be fair. And if I experience life is not fair, then I'm entitled to do something that I feel will be fair or take care of myself. And so part of dealing with the entitlement is also understanding what are those core beliefs that are driving that, like you said, entitlement is what opens the door and gives permission.
Yeah.
Another one is reward. Entitlement says I deserve it. Reward says I have earned it. And so it makes sense with workaholism. If I've overworked, if I've overperformed, I'm exhausted, then I can tell myself, well, I've earned the right to act out. And so it's even understanding how some of these things are interacting with each other to open the door to the sexual acting out.
I want to just mention that sometimes this entitlement place is not about big acting out at all. Like I think about, I'll tell a little funny on Mark and me, at the end of workshops that sometimes, and we knew it was entitlement coming up, but we worked 3 long days, no breaks, blah, blah, blah. And at the end, Mark will say, you want to go to Best Buy and buy something? And I go, is this about entitlement? He goes, yes, absolutely. And so we would do like that. But I was also thinking the other day, whenever I go to a doctor's appointment for myself, I usually stop and get myself coffee and a Danish because it's my reward for having done that. It's just like somewhere along the line, that's what I learned,
Right.
is that you do something hard like that, you get something.
Right.
And so
what if what's true is wise adults give themselves treats for doing difficult things?
That's right.
And so when we are in our wise adult, it is okay to treat.
Yeah.
I think the difference is when we're in that survivor energy, the entitlement is I'm going to do this at all costs.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost other people, typically not myself.
Yeah, and it's going to be secretive.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
And that's one of the differences. We can talk about going and doing something nice for ourselves.
If I
And I
come
don't
home
have
with one more 75-inch flat screen TV,
Your wife's going to leave you.
my wife will leave me. That's right.
It's a little bit too much.
It's too much. There's not an open wall in
You
the
look like a
house.
sports bar there.
Right, exactly, right.
Well, I do think that, as men and as we've identified, women are kind of looking at their motivation. Why do I do what I do? What is it that I'm wanting to escape from? And one of the things I would say is it's very easy for us, if we're not careful, to do some stereotypes around coping strategies. And so we can easily go to an old model where, women are the spenders and men are the savers. But my experience is that is not true. I have a lot of men that I work with, and spending is a part of their coping strategy. And it is part of the addiction interaction. And so to escape the workaholism, they go and spend. And what can be true is for a lot of men, I work with some men that are trying to make a transition where they find something that they're interested in. They would like to buy it at some point. They do lots of research. And then at the end, they may decide not to buy it, or if they buy it, they try to do it in a wise way, including their spouse. That's a very different experience than in secret going and spending money in an impulsive way for something that necessarily isn't the best or what it is that I'm needing. So even as men and women are looking at some of their coping strategies, simply to ask themselves, what are some of the things that I do when life gets complicated or painful or difficult that I choose to try to escape or exit some of my reality?
Wouldn't you say that as we talk with couples, one of the things that they generally argue a lot about is how each of them copes? And, without really being able to identify that for ourselves and own it and maybe make better choices in time, is something that doesn't look that good to another person. Our coping is generally something that's not healthy. And so it makes sense that I can complain about my spouse's coping and he can complain about my coping. But the truth is our way out of this is to work on our own and to identify that, to try to change that so we're making healthy decisions. And that's why we become responsible for our own choices in life.
Right.
And I can't ask someone else to make changes for me or drive me to want to stop something. I really need to own that for myself to make that happen.
And again, here's a plug for community. That's the benefit of community. If I'm in a dynamic with my spouse where it doesn't feel safe to be vulnerable, it is important to have a safe community where I can begin to own those things with others. We talk about the way that we shed shame as we experience truth in safe community. So I can be aware of maybe my misuse of social media or my overspending or my overusing TV. But if I'm just keeping it to myself and trying to work on it within myself, I'm not going to be successful in the way that I would be if I'm able to share it with safe people in my life and be able to bring that into community and shed the shame I might feel around some of the things that I've done and have done in secret.
Yeah.
Well, once again, our time has flown by. I may watch too much TV, but at least I can renovate my bathroom, which is another one of your analogies there. We'd like to thank you for joining us today. We'd like to thank Debbie for being with us again. As always, we really appreciate having you with us. And Greg, you were wonderful as always. I'll go into it later. But anyway, we'd like to thank our viewers and our listeners for joining us on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that you will turn to our website, faithfulandtrue.com, for many other resources that are available to you. All the information and online registration capabilities are there to sign up for one of our 3-day intensive workshops. We do the Men's Journey Workshop every month. We do the Women's and Couples Journey Workshops 3 times a year. So take a look at that schedule. And if that's a desire that you have, if we can be of help to you, we'd love to have you register and come to see us. In the meantime, we'd like to wish you a great and blessing-filled week and hope that we wish you great blessings and great vision.